This week on Quadriga, London 2012. Is the Olympic idea still alive? In a little over 100 days, the Olympic Games will begin in London. Finishing touches are being put on the venues. The government says the Olympics will show the best of Britain. Prime Minister David Cameron, like many Britons, says he feels a sense of excitement and pride. Yet critics ask if it's right to spend so much money when ordinary people are suffering because of the financial crisis. And will the Olympics really benefit the whole country in the long term, as the government is promising? Your host on today's show, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Could the Olympic Games perhaps end up doing more harm than good to the city of London? And are the Games really still first and foremost about the Games, about athletics competing against each other? Those are some of the questions we will address today, together with my three guests. Quentin Peel is chief correspondent for the Financial Times in Germany. He's also an associate editor at the Financial Times. Wolfgang Maennig is professor at economics at Hamburg University. He was an Olympic rowing champion at the 1988 Games in Seoul. And Sylvia Schenk is a former Olympic runner who took part in the 1972 Games in Munich. Currently, she's a lawyer and senior advisor for sports for Transparency International. Thank you all for being here. Quentin Peel, this is now the third time that London will be hosting the Olympic Games. 100 days from now, we will perhaps and most probably see a very lavish opening ceremony. The Olympic Games are usually seized by capitals, by cities to showcase itself. But London is already a world city, isn't it? Why? Explain us. Why did London apply for these games?
You may well ask. I think a lot of Londoners are saying, why did we apply for these games? Everybody's a bit scared. There's going to be traffic jams. There's going to be security problems. So it's not as if everybody is terribly excited. But I think that's just starting to build up now. There's a coincidence between the Olympic Games and the Diamond Jubilee of the Queen. And everybody's been feeling a bit miserable because of the economic downturn and so on. So there is some excitement building up about it now. And I think the one other thing it's been very important, a really poor area of London, the east side of London, which has always been a bit miserable, has actually had a lot of money spent on it. And I think that is something that people are quite happy about.
So the positive effects on London we will discuss in further detail. But Wolfgang Maennig, you've been to the Olympics many times, both as an athlete and an observer. What would you say? What are the motivations behind London's bid to get the Olympic Games?
Yeah, the image effects, the perception effects are always important. And indeed, London doesn't need it that much. So there would be other cities which would need it much more. But of course, it's a national pride. It's a question of national integration. And at least I have heard that Great Britain, as many other industrial nations, as Germany as well, has some problems, maybe connected with the economic crisis of integration. It's the happiness effect which will unify the country again. It's about being proud to host the biggest sport event in the world. So I think we should be aware about the prime objective of the Olympics being the most important sport event, and having the best athletes in the city and in the country. That's the most important thing.
Sylvia Schenk, Wolfgang Maennig is saying the Olympics are still the most important athletic event, sporting event in the world. Would you agree?
Yes, of course it is. And I think we have to see there are always discussions like that before the opening ceremony of Olympic Games or FIFA World Cup. And even in Germany before 1972, we had big discussions. The roof of the stadium that much too expensive, and why are we doing all that? And it's not good for the city. And afterwards, everybody was happy, and it was the same with the FIFA World Cup 2006. And what I think, what for me is the most important point regarding the London Olympics, they really have a message. They are sending a message of sustainability to their own citizens, really advertising for this idea for the future, educating young people on sustainability, which is very important, educating everybody, and then as well bringing a push to the Olympic idea with sustainability. And I think that's very, very important.
It's a very important point you touch upon, of course, sustainability. You've already mentioned the rejuvenation of East London, but how much of it will remain after the athletes and the reporters are gone?
Well, I think the infrastructure obviously is important. There have been big improvements to the transportation system. They've cleaned up things like local parks. There's a brand new, spanking great shopping centre. Actually, it's dreadful, but nonetheless, I suspect people will keep enjoying that afterwards in the area. So there is a feeling that the area has really taken a lift. I think the problem about this is that some of these facilities are so vast because it's the Olympics that they're out of scale with what you need afterwards. And that's a bit of a problem. How do you actually keep using the things? The two biggest facilities they've got problems with what do we do next are the biggest stadium of all, which they're hoping will become a football stadium afterwards, and funnily enough the media centre, which is a shocking great building which they can't obviously find a use for afterwards. But having said that, they really have focused, I think, on trying to do it in a way that will benefit the city in the long run. And I think being a big city like London helps, therefore, because it can be absorbed in a big city. When it's a smaller city, it becomes a huge burden, actually, to live with. So if you remember Athens 8 years ago, I think a big reason why Greece is in real difficulties today is they spent so much money on those Olympic Games 8 years ago, they've never got out of debt.
And Wolfgang Maennig, it is true that the impacts, positive or negative, have been quite different for various cities. Some cities have vastly benefited from hosting the Games, some have not.
Yeah, that's a normal experience in our human lives. An airport can be positive or negative. A university can be positive or negative for the region. It depends on how it is managed and how it fits to the region. And we have some very good examples of Barcelona 92, of Munich 72, even Atlanta 96 in the literature is named as an example of sustainable and positive games for the region. We have some negative examples. Montreal is named for that because of financing problems. So it really depends, but my view is that, or my impression is that the British really took care about the experience and tried very hard to make the best out of it in the short run, but also in the long run.
Well,
which doesn't mean that all dreams will fulfill. Definitely, some will not.
Well, whether all dreams will be fulfilled, all British dreams will be fulfilled, we will see. But let's have a quick look at previous experience of how other cities have benefited from the Games, or not for that matter. Let's have a look.
The opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics back in 2008 heralded a chance for China to strut the world stage as never before. The Games brought many long-term benefits. People in Beijing are still profiting from improved transport links, including better trains and a new airport terminal. The Olympics also produced some memorable architecture, such as the Aquatic Center and the famous Bird's Nest Stadium. Yet today, while attracting many tourists, these buildings rarely host major sporting events. And estimates say it will take 3 decades to recoup construction costs. There are other problems. Many Olympic venues, such as this baseball site, are no longer in use. Critics say authorities failed to plan for the long term.
The cost for building the Olympic venues was substantial, but the organisers failed to put together an overall plan on how to use the venues after the Olympic Games.
It's a similar picture in Greece, which hosted the Games in 2004. Today, more than half the venues are either barely used or abandoned since they cost too much to maintain. So for Athens too, an unclear legacy.
Well, Sylvia Schenk, we just saw the various examples of previous hosts. So would you say that by and large the costs outweigh the benefits?
Well, it depends. If you look onto the legacy of a big sport event, you always have to look at 2 parts. One is infrastructure, and I think London will do much better regarding the reuse of infrastructure after the Olympics than many other cities before them. And the other part is about, I think, I would say, soft skills. So if you look at Beijing, people always forget what the Olympics in Beijing did for the handicapped people in China, because up to the Olympics, to the Paralympics, which are part of the Olympic Games, handicapped were really be discriminated in China. And then with the Paralympics, it changed completely. And talking to people who are experienced with this, they say it's a much, much better situation for handicapped people in China. So that's one different point, but very, very important regarding the improvement. About liberty of press and other things we shouldn't talk regarding China, but at least one point has been improved even in China. And for the London Olympics, once again, what they are doing on recycling, what they are doing regarding how to deal with waste and things like that, it's very, very important. And it brings the Olympic movement to a new step, saying, well, we don't have just to care for the environment, but we have to care for sustainability on the whole. It even includes procurement, for example. They have a very good regulation on procurement regarding the Olympics in London. So these are very important things. And if we look to Sochi, we will have much more problems there with the Winter Olympics 2014.
So Wolfgang Maennig, just to play devil's advocate then, why does it take to the Olympic Games to take on such things such as, you know, a new infrastructure of public transportation, of rejuvenation of a neglected area such as East London? Why does it take the Olympic Games?
Yeah, you're right. In fact, whenever the discussion comes on the costs of the Olympics, I always argue, is it really the costs of the Olympics if you have a new infrastructure for East End? Is it really the Olympic Games if you build new metro lines or metro stations, etc.? It's not the Olympics. It was the region needed it, deserved it beforehand. So indeed, the benefits are non-Olympic for 50 years, 100 years after the Olympics. It's only for 2 weeks Olympic Games, and the cost should be attached to the ex post uses as well. Indeed, I think the role of the Olympics is because in our democracies, it's sometimes very difficult for politicians to come through with a decision to invest money in a certain region. Mm-hmm. And the Olympics is a vehicle to make it sure that it will happen, and that it will happen in a limited time of only 7 years, so much faster than otherwise.
Don't you think, though, that nonetheless the whole scale of it has perhaps got out of control, and that the vast amount of money that's being spent, it's probably double what one would spend in order to revitalise East London, and it's maybe a lot more than one needs to spend to really have a great sporting event. Somehow, I think the whole thing seems to have gone a bit crazy.
Yeah, you're right. But I think the Olympic family has taken notice of that, and there has been the program of more saving money, coming down to earth again, more something, seeing the Olympics as a grassroots movement. And indeed, the ISC now takes care about not having white elephants, which indeed harm the worldwide perception of the Olympic family.
Quentin Peel, we are, of course, in the midst of a euro crisis, and the budget for the Games were initially projected to be £9.3 billion. They've gone overboard by now. It's a tough sell to the public, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And half of the sell was always that they would pay for themselves in the end, that you get enough sponsorship, enough television rights sold and so on, that actually you don't end up with a huge debt burden. Certainly London can't afford a bigger debt burden, and nor can the United Kingdom. It's in as much difficulty as the Eurozone, really. So there is a positive and a negative. There is clearly a big economic boost to the London area and wider from the contracts that have come from this. And maybe the benefit in the end will be proved to be greater than the costs. I suspect in the case of London that's so, because I think London and the United Kingdom can probably manage it. In a smaller country, it might really be a problem at the present time.
Yeah, but again, the £9 billion is a bit a biased figure, I think. The cost of organising the Games in the narrow sense is about £2 billion, and it's fully financed by the income of the organising committee. And the rest is costs for infrastructure, etc., which will be used for decades after the Olympic Games, and which would have been needed even without the Games. So I think we should really be careful about saying it's 9 billion euros and it costs London 9 billion euros or pounds. Sorry.
But don't you think that the games, perhaps in the span of a few decades, have become too commercialized?
Yeah, I can agree to that. Coming from a no money sport or rowing, I can agree that I think that the whole sport, not only the Olympic sport, has become a bit too commercial. And but I don't see a way to cut it back, and especially there's no way to, let's say, go back to the amateurism, because it would mean that the most important part of the worth production chain, the athlete, doesn't get any money, but all the rest, TV stations, marketing agencies, etc., they earn the money. That wouldn't be fair.
So Sylvia Schenk, I was going to say, the Pandora's box has already been opened, says Wolfgang Maennig, so there's no way back, but isn't it kind of taken away from the premise of what the Olympic Games should be about?
Well, but now we are mixing the issues, because if it's about commercialization, it's a different issue, because when we had not so much money, in the 70s, for example, in Montreal, 1976, there was no money for TV rights or only very little, and they spent a lot of money and they had lots of debts. I think they are still paying for it in the city of Montreal. So then we had not so much TV rights, not the big sponsors, and nevertheless the problems regarding the debts have been there, even bigger than I think it will be with London today. So that's a different question. While if we talk about too much money in sports, then we have to see when we talk about doping, when we talk about manipulation of results, because it's about gaining money if you have the victory on your side. And we have to talk about other issues like, for example, the health of the athletes, because they are just thinking of money and not of their health. And you have accidents like at the Vancouver Winter Olympics in the luge, with a very spectacular infrastructure, but too difficult for some of the athletes competing there. So these are the questions we have to discuss, connected with money, but not about the infrastructure.
But is the Olympic idea still alive, is what I want to know, in the midst of all the piles of money that are being attached to the games? Or is that just a naive thought to think that?
No, it is alive, but it's not everywhere. It's in some competitions, it's in some emotions, it is in, well, people meeting one another. If you are, as a fan at the Olympics, meet other fans from other countries, it can be fantastic. But sometimes it's too much nationalism. We had it in Greece, for example, in 2004. Sometimes it's just about money, and then, well, the Olympic spirit is difficult to find.
Don't you think we should go back to a slightly narrower definition of what is sport and actually be a bit more traditional? Yes, athletics, rowing, but beach volleyball, is that really a sport? Or synchronized swimming? I mean, this is a nonsense, isn't it? These things are just titillation.
Well, beach volleyball, I think it's very attractive. It's for the young people. So we have to discuss this. I think it's more difficult to talk about trick ski and things like that. We had two very severe accidents this winter with disciplines like that. So it's about the health of the athletes. I think that's more important than talking about beach volleyball. It's wonderful.
Well, I would say that certainly a large segment of male viewers would contest your view about beach volleyball, but
I'm just saying it's not sport.
What about golf?
Titillation.
But going back to the London Olympics in specific again for a second, because we've talked about the upside notion, about the positive effects, but of course there are also downside, aren't there? It's traffic congestions, hotel prices are going to go up. Only 30% of Brits are enthusiastic about the games, and many of them are saying we're going to skip town as soon as the games start. Will they come around when the games start?
I think that everybody hates, if you like, the run-up to the games, the hype, the exaggeration and so on. And once they start, people just get glued, actually, to their television sets. They don't go out and get stuck in the traffic jams. They probably stay home. So maybe these things won't be as disastrous as people fear. But certainly there is a nervousness, I think, about the whole exercise and an uncertainty about where we want to go. But everybody hopes to get a little bit of the good out of it. I've got a daughter, just bought a house down the road from the Olympic Stadium. She's hoping somebody's going to rent it from her. I don't think they are, probably. So everybody's hoping for a little bit of the action.
Well, we're rooting for your daughter to rent out that space. But the nervousness, of course, you talked about also has a rather serious underlying, doesn't it, with the terror fears that are attached, not just to these Olympic Games, to any major sporting event these days. $1.5 billion are being spent on security alone. Would you say that any city that is going to host, that is going to apply for the Games in the future, will have to reckon with that kind of money for security?
Sadly, yes, I think so. And it's really sad. And indeed, it started in Munich, 72, beforehand. And you might tell about your experience, how open the Olympic Village was. It was easy to enter. There were no real controls for it. That was the reason why it happened. So nowadays, with the threat of terrorism worldwide, with the political tensions in the world, yes, every organizer of World Cups, of Olympic Games, of attractive sport events, where the worldwide perception is there, the worldwide viewership is there, has to take care about it. The other question is whether this is really something where the cost should be attached to the Olympics, or whether that isn't an item where the cost should be attached to, let's say, the political situation in the world. And I think this is the right question. It's not the Olympics, it's
but the security, it is, there wouldn't be this problem of security without having the Olympic Games. Right. It's just that it's because of the global situation, it is worse than it used to be. The other thing that people seem to be scared about at the moment are health scares, about having so many people gathered together coming from different parts of the world. Are we suddenly going to have some sort of health scare? All these things go on. I must admit, we'll deal with the problem when we get to it. I think we can be over careful. That's another part of our modern world, that we're gold plating everything to make sure that nobody can be accused afterwards of having got it wrong. And that adds hugely to the cost of the whole exercise.
But Wolfgang Maennig, of course, touches upon a very important point, namely the politicization of the Games. Politics has always played a big part. Let's think back of the 36 Games in Berlin, of course, the boycotts during the Cold Wars, both in Moscow and Los Angeles. So politics, Beijing, a lot of hopes were attached to the 2008 Beijing Olympics for a more democratic and transparent China. And now it's Syria that is on the agenda. Many people are discussing that Syrian public officials should not attend the Games in London. What would you say?
Well, if it's about the athletes, I think athletes should come to London if it's possible for them to come. Because a boycott is always the wrong answer to any problems. We had it with Moscow in 1980 when Germany, for example, didn't go to the Olympics in Moscow, and it was just a mistake we learned afterwards. So the Olympics gives the possibility to bring people together. I was in Athens at the Olympic ceremony 2004 when the Afghanistan delegation came into the stadium. And it was a very warm applause. It was different to all the applauses for all the other teams. So that was a demonstration. And we had, via Olympics, via sport, already the possibility countries coming together, North and South Korea at least, talking with one another. Doesn't happen up to now, but so things like that. And so that's a chance we have in the Olympics. That's why I think even if we talk about debts, if we talk about all the money going into it, if we talk about all the other problems, there is a big chance with the Olympics, with the idea Pierre de Coubertin had more than 100 years ago to bring people together, to set a sign, a symbol for peace in this world. And this symbol is so important that we really have to fight for it and see how we can develop step by step the right approach.
Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia is seeming to turn this idea of bringing everyone together upside down, because it has recently announced that it will not endorse any female athletes representing Saudi Arabia. Of course, the loophole is that the female athletes themselves could attend without the official endorsement of the government. But really, at the end of the day, what would you say, Wolfgang Maennig?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is harming itself. It will perform worse in the medal account. It will harm half of the population. It will harm the female athletes, which spend a lot of their young lifetimes in training. So I don't understand it. I can't accept it. And I'm sure that it will change in the future. But again, probably it would be better. A boycott of Saudi Arabia would not be the solution. I think it's better to talk to them and to talk to the male athletes and to the male functionaries and demonstrate them what they are missing if they don't have the females in their team.
So how does it work?
It's just one country left, and that's a big success. It's still bad for Saudi Arabia women, yes, but it's one country left. 10, 20 years ago, there were much more countries not bringing any women to the Olympics. So there has been a real change during the last decades. And when I was competing, we had only very little disciplines and sports for women. So nowadays, that has changed completely. I think there was no rowing for women in 1972, as far as I know. Yeah. So that's a development.
And now we even have beach volleyball.
And synchron swimming with only women.
Not to forget.
Yeah, okay. But so it's a development. And I think sport really did a lot for bringing women into the whole world by showing they can run, they can play football, even football, and now they can box. Yeah, it was first Olympics in London with female boxing. I don't think that's very important for men and women as well, but nevertheless, they can do it. And with that, we have changed the reality in quite many societies during the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, there's still a long way to go, because in many cases there are just one alibi women in the team. But you're right. We started the process, and it has come a long way. It's good.
And as you were mentioning earlier, the Paralympics also is a dramatic improvement. It is an extraordinary thing, actually, which is quite recent, that has actually made this, if you like, the Superman, Superwoman side of the Olympics paralleled by something that is doing really a genuine amount for bringing disabled people into the public view. Yeah.
Well, another country that is stirring up some noise in leading up to the Olympic Games is India, because it has recently announced that it might boycott the Games altogether due to sponsoring, namely sponsoring in particular of the Dow Chemical Company. And that background the story goes way back to 1984. Let's have a look what that's all about.
Activists have been staging rallies in India for months. They want to see Dow Chemical dropped as a sponsor of the Games. They accuse the Indian Olympic Association, the IOA, of betraying the victims of the world's worst industrial accident in exchange for funds from Dow.
IOA is the only authority, only body in India that has been taking money from Dow Chemical, because that money is coming directly from IOC. So they need to stop their double speech and make a firm stand that they will not stand by a corporation that faces civil, criminal and environmental liabilities in India for killing more than 25,000 people.
While the activists claim 25,000 were killed, the Indian government says around 15,000 died as a result of the disaster, which occurred when gas leaked from a pesticide factory in the city of Bhopal in 1984. The IOC says Dow cannot be held responsible since it did not own Union Carbide at the time and has settled all compensation claims. The protesters are standing their ground. They're determined to make their voices heard as far as the Games in London.
Well, Sylvia Schenk, is the IOC not being selective enough when it comes to attracting sponsors? Is the IOC sending a wrong message by acquiring Dow Chemical as a sponsor for the Olympic Games in London?
I assume they didn't thought about it, or maybe they even didn't know that they bought the old company that caused this disaster in India nearly 30 years ago. But with the effect now, nobody would know that there are still claims going on regarding Bhopal after all that time if it wasn't for the Olympics. So they didn't want it, but they have helped the victims to bring their problems into the public once again. Well, I don't know the details on the contract with Dow Chemical and the negotiations they had.
But this case, this example, doesn't really help IOC, the reputation of IOC, does it? It's already under assault for being, I don't want to call it a corrupt institution, but certainly there are elements that were criticized in the past. So is that just another stepping stone, if you will, to the manifestation of the IOC as a not-so-transparent organization?
Well, they were transparent regarding this contract. I don't see that they hide it or anything like that. It's a problem. I think it hurts them. I think they know about it, and they will see how to deal together with Dow Chemicals with the situation. And it will teach them a lesson that in future they even have to look onto things like that more carefully than they did in the past. But on the whole, I think with their sponsors, they are usually very selecting them very carefully. They don't have so much sponsors like others. We don't have any sponsors to be seen in the stadiums at the Olympics. So the IOC is much more reluctant on that than, for example, football or other sports. So it's a difficult situation for the IOC, yes. No.
Wolfgang Maennig, as far as the role of the IOC in general is concerned, not only regarding this particular example in India, but in general, do you think that the IOC is living up to its potential, that the institution is as good as it can be?
No, there's always room for becoming better, and that's true for the IOC as well. With the sponsors, well, first of all, the IOC or the Olympic family, they need sponsors which are able to finance huge amounts of money, and there are not so many in the world. I agree that I have my maybe a little bit hesitant thoughts about Dow Chemical, because I don't see why they think it fits to the Olympic movement from both sides, from the Olympics as well as from the chemical industry. To the contrary, one could think that chemistry is near to pharmaceuticals and that's near to doping, so maybe it doesn't fit that well. But nevertheless, I think it's not very fair to blame Dow Chemical to what happened some 30 years ago in India, and it's a real catastrophe. It brings tears to my eyes when I see the pictures. It was a long time before Dow Chemical took over responsibility. And being a political economist, when I see these reports, I always think, who could be behind it? Because, of course, these reports hurt Dow Chemical, and who could be interested in, and maybe competitors. So I think it's not too difficult to make TV reports with some 100, 200 protestants against Dow Chemicals, and I'm a bit shy to interpret it as a real problem for the Olympic movement and for Dow Chemicals. It is a problem for Dow Chemicals because of the image effects, but I'm a bit hesitant to think that it's correct to blame Dow Chemical for that. Mm-hmm.
But it's also a great problem for India. It's a great tragedy for India if they're not going to send their team. They've got lots of wonderful athletes who ought to be participating. And so it's very difficult, this politicisation of sport. I fear we're never going to be able to get away from it, even though I'm sure the athletes themselves do not want to be politicised and used, and so maybe a few individuals, but fundamentally the athletes actually just want to perform well. But then if you go back in history and look at actually how boycotts have worked sometimes, I'm reminded about how the sports boycott did work in South Africa in really, I think, accelerating the process of change in that country. So I'm very torn about whether it's a good or bad thing. I think you may be right that the sports boycott in Moscow, at the Moscow Olympics, was pretty pointless. Both things can happen, but because the Olympics have become such a global phenomenon, the politicization is absolutely inevitable, I think.
Sylvia Schenk, you were, of course, an active participant in the Olympics in 1972 as an athlete. If you talk to athletes today, would you say that it has become more difficult for them, that the pressure on athletes today, compared to your times, are greater, bigger now?
Well, of course. In our times, we were amateurs, so we didn't really earn money. We had to study beside. We had to look for the future, what we will do. Nowadays, many athletes can just focus onto their sport, trying to make a living out of it, but it's dangerous because you are injured and then everything comes to an end and then you are standing there with nothing. And the pressure, the media, it's much higher than it used to be. So for the athletes nowadays, they can earn much more money. They can leave after some years and being rich. That was no possibility at my time. But I wouldn't change for my time, because I really enjoyed it, and I had time for my friends, I had time for my law studies and everything, and today it's very, very difficult. And then with all the doping issues, we had doping controls as well at that time, but it was nothing compared to nowadays, where you have to be available nearly all the time and no data protection for athletes. I think it's a very bad situation for athletes nowadays, and I would never do something like that.
Wolfgang Maennig, you of course won gold in rowing in 1988 in Seoul. Again, the same question. If you look back, would you like to trade with the current rowing team?
Well, rowing is very demanding, and I remember that I really were afraid of the races, and I'm happy that I don't have to race in London. But nevertheless, I met some of the rowers, and there was a little bit of envy of these upcoming weeks and becoming maybe Olympic champion. I know that the British want to become the champions in the 8, but I cross the fingers for the Germans, of course. So I think it's still worth to struggle and to train and for the Olympics and to live your young life, at least in big parts for the Olympics. It's still a dream, and I can only support everyone I would support everyone who wants to do it.
And you, of course, were, after winning gold, you were at numerous Olympic Games afterwards as an observer. What are the most important changes, aside from the commercializations of the game, and what are the most important changes to the athletic aspects of the games?
Well, it's a very general question, and I think it has become more professional. That's a general statement.
Do you regret that?
No, because I remember very well that, for example, I complained about our medical support. I complained about nourishment. I complained about psychological support. There was nothing of that. And it was evident that other nations, like, for example, the Americans, were much more advanced in all these items. We German athletes, we didn't have it. And now they have it, at least. And I think it's good for the performance, and this is what the Olympics is about, to get the last potential, to make use of the very potential of every individual in a fair competition. And today, the athletes have a better chance to go to the limits of their potentials.
And to make the best of the athletes, but also to make the best of the city, of course, which brings us back to our initial point of London wanting to seize the opportunity to showcase itself, of course. But the Londoners, as we said, they haven't come around yet, but they might at the end of the day. But for the government, do you think for the current government, for Prime Minister Cameron in particular, this will be a good opportunity to boost his standing if you will, among the public?
I think he's going to try and use it. We've already seen him playing badminton in the garden of his number 10 Downing Street, which immediately, of course, gets him into trouble because it's seen as an elite sport rather than a sort of ordinary sport for people. They're going to try and use it. They're going to try and use it to cheer people up at a time when people are feeling a bit miserable about the economy. And I think people are all going to get caught up in it in the end. I don't like the nationalism. I don't like the over-patriotism about the whole thing. I think if we could only focus on the individual achievements a bit more than the national achievements, that would be much better. But having said that, in the end, you get caught up in the sheer atmosphere of saying, my God, that is an amazing sports person who's done this or that. What a wonderful achievement. And I think we just get caught up in it.
Sylvia Schenk, of course, overboarding nationalism is something nobody wants to see. But at the end of the day, isn't a healthy dose of patriotism the glue, if you will, that draws the viewer to the telly and that makes the people root for their teams?
A healthy dose is always okay from everything, yeah? But if it's unhealthy, it's wrong.
Yeah, and we've seen it does get a bit exaggerated, and some countries really push. And
it will not in London. I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
In Britain, what are the most important steps in your view that the British people, that Britain can seize from these games, aside from rejuvenation of East London and tourism and so on and so forth, really on a sustainability level? What are the most important two things?
I think probably the most important is to make young people enthusiastic about sport again. We've rather lost that in Britain now in our schools and so on. We've lost out in the passion right at the grassroots level to be just good locally at sport. And that comes back to the desire to actually, it would be lovely to see a bit more amateurism and a bit less professionalism. Just have ordinary people go out and play tennis. Every year when we have Wimbledon, suddenly you see the tennis courts are full again in the summer. And I would love to see more of that in Britain.
Well, on that note, let's certainly hope that the daughter of Quentin Peel gets her flat rented out during the Olympic Games. And we, of course, look forward to the beach volleyball teams, of course, not just the females, but also the male teams, of course. I want to thank my three guests for sharing their insights on these games. We look forward, nonetheless, despite all the obstacles that perhaps may remain to the Games. 100 days from now, we will look forward to the opening ceremony in London. For that, I look forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.